constricted by the financial system that year in and year out, all Argentina can do is pay an average of 2/3 of the interest on the public debt. Interest on the public debt. Why? Because the system has been set up that way. It's been going on now for over 30 years, and it's been the main the main problem that Argentina has to come to grips with, and it never will. Why do I say this? You figure, well, what the bankers should have already collapsed you years ago. Because the idea behind debt is to ensure that you can never pay it. So what is the worst thing that Argentina could do right now? And I mentioned this because you might start to understand what the worst thing America could do. The worst thing Argentina could right now do to the bankers is to call them and say, hey, bankers, our total public debt is $200 billion. Here's a $200 billion check. It'll clear through the bank and pay everybody, the private banks, the investors, the IMF, the World Bank, everything. Here's your money. Don't come back. We will be generating two gigantic problems to the whole global power elite. First problem, where are they going to find another bunch of idiots to pay to lend $200 billion at usury rates? So that's the first problem. And the second problem is we would become a literally independent and free country. We would say, guys, I don't owe you anything. Don't send me your IMF missions. Don't tell me what to do with tax revenues. Don't tell me what I have to do with the state. Just don't come back. So in a way, and this is something which is very old because it goes back, and I think one of the best examples is William Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, where you have the usurer Shylock lending 3,000 ducats to a tradesman, to a merchant, Antonio, and he has his bond. He signs a contract saying, if you don't pay the money by such and such a date, you're going to have to give me a pound of your flesh, which the guy signs and so forth. Well, as usually happens with Shakespeare, it's a very dramatized thing. There's a shipwreck. The money doesn't come in on time, and Antonio cannot pay on the due date. So what does Shylock do? He says, I want my pound of flesh. In the meantime, Antonio's friends say, listen, Shylock, I'll give you twice the money, 10 times the money. And he says, no, he did not pay the debt by such and such a date. I want my pound of flesh. What's your conclusion? He never wanted the money back. He wants the pound of flesh. In the case of Argentina, the pound of flesh is Argentina's territory because it's already been going around for decades now, the whole idea, well, and this, I can give you an example. The New York Times said that on one of their main articles, and when we were right in the midst of our last crisis, in August of 2002, they said, well, if Argentina cannot pay their foreign debt, why don't we do a debt for territory swap? So in a way, what the whole banking system is behind, they want the pound of flesh. They don't want the money back. And we have to understand that because you see, if you figure that all the economic and financial problem is something that you have to try and sort out on the financial or the economic stage, you might lose sight that there are other much deeper, much far-reaching geopolitical objectives behind all of this. And the same with America. I mean, America has a huge debt, and they just want you to roll over. I mean, bankers don't want you to give them money back because if you give them money back on a loan, it means that you got to make them work. They got to find somebody else to loan the money to. They want you to refinance 1 year, 10 years. As long as you are more or less solvent, or they perceive you as being solvent, they will refinance you forever. That's why sovereign public debts are their favorites.
That's a fact. Hey, I want to go to the phones real quick. Dean from Texas, you're live on the air.
Well, thanks for taking my call. I'm really enjoying the discussion. You have two of my what I call my sanity squad there. Griff and Adrian have kept me sane over the last year and a half or so. Hearing the stories and the about the situation, but I really just to get to my point, Adrian, since you've been through these problems a few times before, do you have any sage advice or wisdom to throw down to us to help us survive? I remember you telling stories about when the hyperinflation was going, people buying land in the morning so they would have something to sell the next day. Do you see things like this coming here?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And look, if anything, here what we have to do, and I know it takes an effort for many people, not for you guys, but it takes an effort for many people. You have to take one step backward and do things based on common sense, which, as we all know, is the least common of senses that a lot of people have. Because what does common sense tells you? Well, there are a couple of rules of thumb. For example, divide what is financial from what is economic. Financial is always virtual. It's always a promise on something. Like a dollar is not a banknote. It's not a dollar. It's a promissory note. It's always something, a little bit of paper that I will promise to give you something, and that is supposedly worth something. Or it can just be a little blip on a computer screen. However, when a crisis comes about, the best thing to do is use your common sense, take one step backward, and move away from financial assets into economic assets. In other words, to things that have intrinsic value. If they, we know, I keep because just let me give you an example. Since 1970, Argentina had 4 monetary reforms. In each one of them, they knocked zeros off our currency because inflation was so bad. In all, we've knocked 13 zeros from our currency since 1970. So, if I have a peso in my hand, which will only pay me for a downtown Buenos Aires bus ride, in 1970 that would have been 10 trillion pesos, and it would have purchased Argentina 10 times over. That's to give you an inflation, to give you an idea what inflation is all about. So I have a collection of all these various bits. I have a 1 million peso bill from 1980 something, and you would figure 1 million pesos, yeah, that bought you about a loaf of bread. That's what it was good for. Why do I say this? Because when the crisis comes and it hits bad, paper is only worth. The money is only worth the paper it's written on, and you might end up having to put it in your bathroom because that's the only use you will give for it. However, intrinsic value assets will always hold their intrinsic value. For example, if you have a couple of extra bucks that you're not going to need mid and long term, buy gold. No matter what happens, gold will always retain its intrinsic value. If you have a bit more money, you want to buy land. You want to buy an apartment, buy a house, even buy a car. Because you see, once the crisis is over, and things, which always happens because it's human nature, even after wars, once things go back to quote-unquote normal, the relative price of a loaf of bread, a car, an apartment, and, I don't know, precious metals will always end up looking more or less alike. I'll give you an example. I used to live in downtown Buenos Aires. I don't anymore. And I had an apartment that I paid about $120,000 for. You know, compared to American prices, they're lower down here, in 1998. Well, the crisis came, and I remember once looking at what an apartment would be worth, and the price had gone down to the floor and so forth. But once the crisis was over, in 2007, I was able to sell the apartment for about $140,000, the equivalent of, which means that once the crisis is over, real economic assets tend to recover their original value. If instead of having that, I would have had the equivalent in pesos of $120,000, it would have just been, paper to throw out the window, which is what happens in all hyperinflationary processes and so forth. So in times of trouble, when you know that you can't, trust anything, because from a financial point of view, the most trustworthy financial asset is cash. Because, the most trustworthy thing you can have in America, if you're just going to say, I'm just going to stick to financial investments, is U.S. dollar bills, because everything it's dangerous. Stocks in companies, hedge funds, derivative investments, all those get more and more and more risky. So the least risky asset on the financial side is a dollar bill, and yet if the dollar hyperinflates, that's not going to be useless. You cross the real dividing line into the real economy, and there you can think of a million things that you can buy which are crisis-proof: gold, jewelry, works of art, a house, land, and so forth. And if I were to be able to say, well, what would be your main recommendation for anybody in America who has some money and wants to really put it safely away, choose your favorite economic asset, whatever it is, house or gold or whatever, and stay there until normal times come back.
Did that answer your question, Dean?
Yeah, it's great. It's great advice. Thank you very much. I'm
Thank you, Dean.
Immensely.
No sweat, Dean, and thanks for the call. Other things too. In these times, now there's a lot of people, especially my listeners here, they don't have a lot of money to spend, Adrian, and they don't have that type of thing. So one thing that we try to bring upon them is that there are other precious metals other than, say, silver and gold. There are precious metals like brass and lead, which when you put them together, they make a bullet. And there's also firearms, things like that, where we can purchase those. And, yes, they retain their value, but they also have a dual purpose. You know, that you can barter with them, and at the same time, you can protect with them, you can hunt with them, you can do whatever you need to do. So,
brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are really in very interesting times. We're starting to see these little currencies pop up in the United States too, like different localities are coming up with their own little different currencies. Sheer buck, or Ithaca has Ithaca, New York has their own little something. So I really feel like we are at that point now where we're starting to see this breakdown. It makes me wonder how rapid it's going to be, and I know that we have a little bit more control in the United States only because we can print our own money. I mean, the central bank just pretty much rolls it off. But what do you think? I'm going to pose you the question. What do you think would happen right now if this quantitative easing, if they pumped $1 trillion, we'll just say throw a figure out, into the economy right now? Well, they just did that. What do you think the effect of that would be?
Well, it depends how they pump it in and what shape and form it takes. If it's going to be $1 trillion in Federal Reserve notes, and they're going to pump it into the bank for the banks to recycle, I always ask, why don't they pump the money into the people who are facing foreclosure so that they can pay the banks and theoretically get the banks to get their act right by getting the money from down upwards instead of giving them trillions of dollars from up downwards, most of which, or a good part of which, they've used for CEO bonuses, which I think is probably already contains the answer right in there. You see, it depends on how the money goes into the economy. You don't just save an economy by putting tons of money into it. If your gas tank is only, 60 or 70 gallons, whatever, 40 gallons, you can't put 400 gallons into it. You can say, okay, 40 gallons will get me from here to, to Texas. If I put 400 gallons into the gas tank, it'll get me from here to Argentina, because your gas tank just cannot cope with 400 gallons. It was not made for that. And here I think, and I think that the best way to perhaps focus that question is to look at it, and sorry to insist on this, by looking for a minute away from the economy, away from finance, and looking at it geopolitically. What you guys, and I hate to say this way, but I mean, I think it's got to be, it's important to bring the subject. What America now is living is that the powers that be that have been working on organizing and setting up a world government that is now going to be legally binding, they cannot tolerate a powerful United States of America, for the simple reason that so far America has been controlled by them, and in the last 20 years, for instance, or even more, 25 years, they've always managed to put a friend in the White House. George Bush Sr., 8 years before that, Ronald Reagan, 8 years of Bill Clinton, 8 years of George W. Bush, and now Obama. Always a friend of theirs and not a friend of the American people, but it would be too complex to go and look into the reasons for that. However, they know that if tomorrow a real patriot were to sit in the White House, in the Oval Office, and a real patriot were to say, I'm going to do away with the Federal Reserve and I'm going to start bringing back real money and not this fake promissory note money. I'm sick of our foreign wars to benefit other countries. I'm sick of our policy of unconditionally supporting Israel, for example. I'm sick of a whole lot of things. I'm going to start doing things focused on the common good of the American people and the national interest of America. Wow. The global power elite would be in a lot of trouble, because if Argentina were to do that, you can easily squash Argentina with your thumb. But if America were to do that, wow, they will be in a lot of trouble. And give me a minute to say why I mentioned this.
Sure.
Today we've all become too short-term thinkers. I mean, we are actually forced into that by the media, by the saturation of too much information. Everything goes so fast, et cetera, et cetera. We can hardly even gather our wits. So we just become short-term thinkers. How we're going to solve problems tomorrow and next Friday. If you stop for a minute and you start thinking in the mid and in the long term, what you can see is that the bipolar world, in other words, the world divided between the USSR and its allies and America and its allies, that lasted from 1945 until 1990, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and so forth,